Hi, Jen. How are you doing?
Good.
We are going to get started in just a couple minutes. We're going to just give people time to call in here. And in the meantime, I'm going to make sure that my screen share is working. Let's give it a go. All right, Jen, how's that looking?
I can see your screen, you're launching Zoom, and I can see the end of the presentation.
Great. And the beginning.
There we go, I see it.
Fabulous. That's what I like to hear.
Everything's in working order.
Can you also see me in one of the video icons?
I can.
Perfect. So while I'm presenting, you can answer questions that pop up in the chat box. I'm probably going to minimize the people's pictures because otherwise it shows up in the recording, which we don't want. And so if you see a lot of faces of confusion, feel free to jump in and stop me. Because I won't be able to see everyone's facial reactions to what I'm saying. Jen, are you currently the meeting host?
How do I know?
I think you are, because it says that I'm not, which means that you are the one who can record. Do you have the option?
I see a little icon in the upper right of the Zoom that says recording with a red light. So is someone already recording this?
If it says recording, then yes. I actually think I set it automatically.
Oh, okay. We're being recorded.
Are you able to hit stop recording there? All right. If anyone has questions while we are going, drop them in the chat box and Jen will answer them. And I'm sorry, I didn't introduce my colleague Jen is also on the call, calling in from Raymond. Sorry, I skipped you there, Jen. So if you have questions, drop them in the chat box and we'll also pause and have time for some questions and discussion. So what is messaging? Messaging is the way that we frame our events, our actions, our campaigns, and stories to communicate our work and engage with our audiences. You can also think of messaging as communications or comms or many other, goes by many names. Now, Milton Friedman is a famous free market economist and is a pretty unlikely messenger for our movement, but he knew that only in times of crisis can we really, really change what is politically possible. Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. So right now, we have an unprecedented opportunity to make the ideas that we have lying around, like a $15 minimum wage and $1 trillion investment in energy infrastructure, into a reality. Our adversaries also know this, and they will be fighting to use this crisis as a chance to roll back regulation, to spread racism and fear, and to consolidate money and power for the 1%. But by unifying our message around the country, we can improve our odds in this ideological battle and hopefully win the new common sense policy, hopefully win this ideological battle for the new common sense policies of our nation. And if we want to win, we need to control the narrative. So this presentation is about how to do that, controlling the narrative. And I see a comment in the chat that you're reading The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein, and that is totally relevant, and we have borrowed a lot of ideas in this presentation from Naomi Klein herself. So who is our audience? Before we develop messaging, we need to know who we are trying to reach. And one of the things that sets a social movement building organization like 350 New Hampshire apart from a group that is focused either on lobbying or on making change in the private sector is that our primary audience is not legislators, it's not donors, it's not businesses, it's not politicians, it's actually the public. Our elected officials and our government will eventually support the ideas that the public considers common sense. So how do we win public support? Is the way that we are talking going to connect with millions of people that we need on our side to control the narrative and motivate them to join our movement? That's the question that we ask ourselves every time we put out something in writing, something on the radio, something on our website. Is this going to reach the millions of people that we need on our side to win? So we have a couple rules that guide us in this messaging. 1, we make it simple. 2, we make it matter. 3, we appeal to commonly held values. 4, we present clear choices. And 5, we combat racism. And generally, we combat discrimination wherever we see it. So we want to make it possible for the public to easily enter the conversation, to spread our narrative, and to support our movement. The UN climate report says that a 1.2 Celsius increase in global temperature and 5,000 parts per million carbon in the atmosphere will result in the polar ice caps melting at a rate of 4.5 meters per week. This is why climate change is bad. Raise your hand, show of hands, for anyone who zoned out while I was reading that long sentence. Anyone zone out? I've read this a lot of times and I often zone out. Show of hands, anyone who didn't know what one of the acronyms or one of the abbreviations in this sentence is. Anyone? PPM, yeah. There's a lot going on there. And it might seem obvious, but for decades, this is how people talked about the climate crisis. And they wondered why regular people didn't care, wondered why regular people weren't in the streets protesting. And I'm seeing a lot of content exactly like this statement in relation to the coronavirus on Facebook. Now, there is totally a place for scientific knowledge in our movement, and there are people for whom we need to communicate in exactly this way in order to reach them, but they are not the majority. And if we want people to wear a mask at the grocery store, then a Facebook post that is 3 paragraphs of numbers and charts and epidemiological studies is not the way to get people to take action. So we have a couple rules for making it simple. 1, we just use simple language. We avoid science jargon. Generally speaking, if a 14-year-old wouldn't understand it, I don't say it or write it. 2, we use short sentences. And 3, we keep a positive attitude. People want to be a part of something that is possible. We have to walk a really fine line when we're talking about the climate crisis between making people want to stick their heads in the ground and showing them that it is serious enough that they need to care. So when have you seen a message that made it simple? Drop them in the chat box. Who can think of an example of a message that was really simple? Advertisers do this too well for the common good. Anyone can think of an example of a message that made something really simple?
So in relations to the COVID crisis, right? The flattening of the curve.
Flatten the curve. Yeah, that's pretty simple. In itself, it's, unless you have some background, it's not clear, but flatten the curve has definitely become the go-to messaging. Anything else come to mind? Just do it is a really good example. Yeah, just do it. Everyone knows what that means. Everyone, can hear that and repeat it. Here are a couple of examples. Black Lives Matter. There's not much more simple than the premise that someone's life matters. Water is life. Another good one coming out of the Indigenous rights movement and the climate movement. Save lives, control guns. Very clear, simple messages. Principle 2, we want to make it matter. We want to tell a meaningful story so the public wants to engage with and support us right now. We will begin to see the effects of climate change in 40 years. Again, it seems funny, but this is how people have been talking about the climate crisis for decades. And again, people are surprised that the public has not taken action sooner. People will take action when something is urgent and important to them right now. I just lost my job and my healthcare and I need money to feed my family right now has a very different impact than the economy may take decades to recover when we are talking about the coronavirus pandemic. When have people seen messages that made it matter? Drop them in the chat, examples. What comes to mind? Something that really mattered. Just do it again. Build the wall. Build the wall is a really good one. It matters because it brings out fear in people. It's like, oh, we have to build a wall to keep out the outsiders. And it's like this urgent thing. And unfortunately, it's been used really successfully against our movements. But that's a great example. I deserve hazard pay because I put my life at risk so people can buy groceries. This is simple and it matters. It matters to me, especially because this is a union and a store that I have a friend who works in. So I'm able to picture, not only this person, but my friend who is actually on the front lines at risk. And yeah, they deserve hazard pay. Anne Frank died of typhus, not a gas chamber. Not a gas chamber. ICE detainees can't social distance. Free them all. This matters because it's urgent. Yeah, we have less than 12 years. I can see that either way. I can also see people thinking in 12 years is a long time if they're not really thinking about the level of change that we need. I actually think that message, while it has galvanized huge levels of involvement that we hadn't seen before, it also is still a little bit falling into this trap of the climate crisis is a later problem, when in reality we know, because we're feeling it right now here in New Hampshire, all over New England, that the climate crisis is a problem right now. So we want to appeal to commonly held values. We can find common ground with the vast majority of people by rooting our messaging in things that we all believe in. When have you seen a message that appealed to commonly held values? Let's get a couple examples here. What comes to mind? Feel free to take yourself off mute and just shout them out.
We have the People's Bailout, and access to healthcare is a human right.
Yeah, definitely access to healthcare as a human right is a big one. Most people believe that. Not all, but many. Don't mess with my future. I think in the United States, we have a commonly held value that children deserve a livable future. Even people who are really not on our side yet about the climate crisis, I find that they are usually pretty on board with the idea that kids deserve a right to clean air and clean water and a livable future. And that everyone deserves food on their table. That's another big one in our society, especially kids. People seem to be really aligned around the idea that, at the very least, children should be guaranteed access to healthy food, no matter where they come from or where they are. So this happened to us a couple times when we were out canvassing for the primary in New Hampshire. We were out in Bow, New Hampshire, and Epping, New Hampshire, and we would knock on a door and, be ready to talk to someone about a coal plant or, a gas pipeline that's proposed for their community. And we'd lead with climate change, and quickly the person would say, I don't know, climate change, I'm not sold. So we can tell the person is in this tiny minority of people in our country who are still doubting that climate change is real. And we pivot to commonly held values. We pivot and we stop talking about climate change and we start talking about their right to clean air and their right to make decisions over what type of energy they get in their town, which is a value that very much appeals to people in New Hampshire, is this right to sort of local self-governance. And we found that we were able to mobilize people in terms of values that they shared with us, even when they were totally not on board with the main issue that we were there to talk about. So the fourth pinnacle of our messaging is that we present clear choices. We want to make it easy for the public to join our side and share in our narrative. We make it easy for the public to join us by framing issues as a struggle between the overwhelming majority of everyday working people who just want clean air, clean water, and adequate protections against the coronavirus, versus a tiny 1% of the population who oppose our interests and stand to profit off of these crises. And there are a small minority of ultra wealthy and powerful people right now using the pandemic and the climate crisis to get rich at the expense of our health and safety. These are the Trumps and the Rex Tillersons of the world, who are people profiting off of the sale of bogus medications, who are undercutting our state's abilities to buy protective gear, and who are taking advantage of the public's disorientation during the pandemic to roll back environmental regulation so that they can increase their profits in the dirtiest industries on our planet. We live in unprecedented times of polarization, largely on a left to right political spectrum. But your neighbor or your cousin who is still going to the grocery store 3 times a week, or your uncle who maybe voted for Trump, or your neighbor, they are not the opposition. They are regular people who we need in our movement in order to win. And when we frame our debates between the left and the right, and we ask people to choose, we lose millions of people who don't feel like they fit into one of these ideological categories, left, right, or center. And we lose the millions of people out there who feel disenfranchised from politics and don't want to engage with us. Do you stand with the CEO of ExxonMobil or with the millions of everyday people who just lost their jobs? By presenting our opposition as a tiny fraction of the population, like the CEO of ExxonMobil, who is, in my opinion, virtually beyond human empathy, we are framing the choice instead in terms of a 99% versus a 1%. And this makes it very easy for people to feel included and welcomed into our movement. This framing and messaging can also help to heal the unprecedented polarization in our country by overcoming some of the false divisions between working people on the right and the left and framing the real enemy for who they are. See, it's a couple things in the chat box. Right. I am going to pause for questions. This idea of us versus them and intentional polarization of the society is one that we often get some pushback on from people. So I want to open it up for questions from anyone who's got one. And you can take yourself off mute and say it or drop it in the chat, whichever you prefer, if there are any.
I mean, it seems to me that the word climate change itself has just been so politically polarized as a left issue. I'm not sure how to go about, I guess, divorcing it from this idea of left and right.
That's a great question. And you're totally right. Climate change has totally become a partisan issue when it had no business being a partisan issue. I mean, what is less partisan than something that will affect every human on the planet? Um, I have not seen a move to change the term climate crisis. I have not seen a push to stop using that and start using something else. I have heard and seen a push to stop using the term global warming and start using climate crisis, because crisis brings more of a sense of urgency to the situation, and also because um, climate change and the climate crisis does not just mean warming. And there are people out there who are experiencing other things that aren't warming, but that are equally catastrophic. And so I have seen a shift there. But what you bring up is a great point, and I don't have an answer for it. What we can say is that there are people on both sides of the aisle, people within this framework of left and right, who do identify as left or right. Because I always have, but a lot of people never have, who are worried about the climate crisis and want to see the government take action to do something about it. Climate emergency is a good one. I've definitely seen that, and that gets around a little bit this idea of like change, because of course we've seen a lot of pushback to this idea of climate change, of like, well, is it changing, and like people getting really hung up on proving it or not. So climate emergency sort of sidesteps that and just says the climate is in an emergency right now, which matters to all people, and is pretty urgent messaging. I think is good messaging that we've seen a lot popularized by Extinction Rebellion and by the youth climate strike, for sure. Other questions or thoughts on that? Has anyone heard a term used that gets at this question of how to move forward when the idea is already so polarized? I think perhaps a Green New Deal is a message that has been used to sort of get past. Thanks, Rick. So you got to go. I think a Green New Deal is an idea and a message that has been used to sort of sidestep the issue of climate change. It just gets right to the solution instead of talking about the problem, and doesn't use any of these words that have become so polarized. That could be one option. And actually, the quick rise of the Green New Deal as a narrative framework for climate solutions is an example of the way that we can use messaging to advance change. So we're no longer talking about polar bears and the loss of insect species. We are talking about millions of people whose homes are being washed away and burned down in climate fires and floods. And we're talking about the creation of millions of good, high-paying union jobs. And we are making huge progress. Public support for the Green New Deal is actually so high that every major presidential candidate in the Democratic primary, from Bernie to Biden, publicly supported a Green New Deal because they knew that they couldn't win without our movement's support. And give a shout out to Sunrise Movement for this picture featured here. This was taken at a sit-in in Nancy Pelosi's office a couple years ago. So how do we influence the public narrative when it comes to the coronavirus pandemic, and what is our goal? Our nation is in an unprecedented crisis, and the way that we respond will have far-reaching effects on our economy and our lives for decades to come. Policymakers in the administration have put forward plans that attempt to return the economy back to the status quo, where safety and security are promised only to corporations and the wealthy few. They are gambling trillions of tax dollars on stimulating the stock market, which can't fix a shortage in hospital beds or the pollution that is exacerbating the coronavirus pandemic for people right now on the ground. We can't stop the coronavirus pandemic and we can't stop the pandemic without changing the structural problems that plague our country. Our nation's progressive movements have coalesced around the People's Bailout as the narrative and messaging framework for our demands. And we're going to talk a little bit about what is in the People's Bailout. Who has seen this framework? Has anyone heard about this or seen this already? See some hands, yes. Some people might be new. So you can find more information at thepeoplesbailout.org, and you can see that more than 1,000 organizations representing millions of people in our country have already signed on to show their support. The following are 5 key demands of the People's Bailout. 1, health is a top priority for all people, no exceptions. 2, we want to provide economic relief directly to the people. 3, we want to rescue workers and communities, not corporate executives. Oh, sorry, I've got some pop-ups going on there. 4, we want to make a down payment on a regenerative economy while preventing future crises. So this is the component of the People's Bailout where many of the elements of a proposed Green New Deal have found a home. The People's Bailout and the Green New Deal are ultimately 2 frameworks to get us towards similar societal systemic change. The People's Bailout, of course, is in response to the coronavirus pandemic, and the Green New Deal is in response to the climate crisis. But at the end of the day, there are a lot of similarities between the proposals. So in point 4, it actually says, we want to rebuild our infrastructure. We're going to expand wind and solar power, build clean and affordable public transit, weatherize buildings, restore our wetlands, expand public services. Many of the things that are found in a Green New Deal are part of what it means to make a down payment on a regenerative economy. And 5, we want to protect our democratic process while protecting each other. After what we saw happen in Wisconsin and what we are seeing happen in New York, we know now more than ever that our voting rights are under attack, and we need to be sure that government action to stop the pandemic includes really strong protections for our democracy, as well as really strong protections for our essential workers who are putting their lives on the line to sell us groceries and operate the postal system and all of the other things that our society cannot function without. So the principles for a People's Bailout are what are informing the policies, and it is what is informing the advocacy that we are calling for at a state and federal level. We want to put people's health first. We want to provide economic relief. We want to help our workers. We want to create resilience, and we want to build solidarity and community across borders. We know that we cannot solve the coronavirus pandemic by looking at the United States alone. And we know that closing our borders and villainizing immigrants is not the way to create the change we need. So what values is the People's Bailout rooted in? And how can we make this framework appeal to people in New Hampshire, or if you're calling in from somewhere outside of New Hampshire, to people where you live? I am going to end my screen share for a minute here to put us into a couple breakout groups to actually discuss this question. So again, what are the values in the People's Bailout? And how can we make this framework and this message appeal to the people that we need on our side? It's going to come down to a choice at some point where we're going to need our representatives in Congress to vote on these stimulus packages, and they're going to support the narratives that we as their constituents support. So it's really important that we develop messaging and a framework that is going to work for our community. The People's Bailout is something that has been developed nationally, and I want us to have a quick breakout on how we can make that impactful and resonant for people where we live. All right, so I'm going to stop a share, and Jen, you can pause the recording that's going on. And because of environmental racism and practices like redlining, communities that are home to fossil fuel infrastructure, like coal plants, are disproportionately made up of low-income communities and communities of color. And those are now the communities experiencing the greatest number of coronavirus deaths. So we need to be clear that the coronavirus does not impact white communities and communities of color in the same way, just as deaths from asthma and air pollution do not impact communities of color and white communities in the same way. And we need to be clear in our messaging that the solutions to the coronavirus pandemic must include solutions to the systemic racism that is causing the imbalance in deaths and the experience people are living right now. Only in a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function: to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable. So this is the work of our movement today: to develop the ideas and alternate policies to solve the climate crisis and stop the coronavirus pandemic, and to keep them alive and available until they become politically inevitable. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, so I know we're seeing this movement to bring up, politically, previously politically impossible ideas on the left. Do you see a parallel movement happening on the right?
Yes. So right now we are seeing what Naomi Klein, I believe, has coined disaster capitalism. And it pops up whenever there is a disaster, real or perceived, where we have the alt-right basically using the public's disorientation to privatize everything, pass economic austerity measures, and just undermine all of the work that we are doing. So absolutely, yes, we are seeing things like the EPA rolling back regulations. We are seeing all sorts of ideas that Milton Friedman himself probably would have been in favor of, vying for dominance. And ultimately, I don't think I can say right now, like, who's going to win out. I don't think it's clear. Has anyone else seen examples of the alt-right doing this, of pushing for their ideas to be included in the stimulus packages and in the CARES Act? One example that comes to mind is of Mitch McConnell saying that we should just let the states go bankrupt, right? Like, that is a ridiculous fringe idea that I'm sure Mitch McConnell and his right-wing cronies have been waiting around to pass in order to, just bankrupt states and bust up unions and weaken the last vestiges of the idea that the federal government should be taking action to protect people. And we're going to see if that idea wins out. We haven't yet. But that's a great question, and there's an ugly history. And Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine goes into a lot of details about that. I haven't read it yet, but it's been highly recommended. Other questions? Can drop them in the chat box or just take yourself off mute to ask them if you've got questions. All right. If you enjoyed this training, we encourage you to support 350 New Hampshire. You can go to our website and click on donate, or there's a link here. We are encouraging people to sign up as monthly members, and because we know that there is really unprecedented need in our state right now, staff at 350 New Hampshire are actually matching the first month of any new monthly member sign up to New Hampshire Mutual Aid and Defense, which is an organization that is working with people who don't have housing and people who have really direct aid needs, such as food and shelter. So thanks everyone for joining us, and we will make the recording of this training available on our website in case you want to share it around or give it another listen. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me at lila@350nh.org. Thanks everyone, and stay safe out there.